the temple website that people also, that gives us a recording that we can refer to if we need it. Welcome to our 2 o'clock session. This has really been a great day so far, and it's going to keep getting better because we just have such a wealth of knowledge and such a great set of presenters coming. And I know you all have the list, and Will, as everybody knows, is somebody who just has a wealth and a breadth of knowledge on all topics religious, and has kind of focused it on Judaism and specifically Jewish mysticism of late. And so it's my honor to share our congregant, our friend, my friend, to give him this opportunity to share some of his studies in mysticism and how it pertains specifically to the Ten Commandments, which is a focal point of the holiday of Shavuot. So, Will, I'm going to spotlight you and turn over, and I've got the PowerPoint ready to go. And we welcome you.
Well, thank you, sir, very much. It's good to be here and to see some folks on the screen again. It's been bad enough that we have had that we've had a year of enforced solitude, but in the last 3.5 weeks since my surgery, I haven't even seen anybody on screen. So it's good to be with you. We're going to talk about a look at a mystical look at the Ten Commandments, but I'd like to start with a couple of housekeeping points, if I may. One is the knee surgery. 3.5 weeks ago, I had a total replacement of my left knee. And I was really optimistic about how that was going to go, but it turns out I'm probably less than halfway into what is the standard recovery period for that surgery. So I'm still kind of dealing with lots of pain and lack of sleep and therefore exhaustion. So, and also now that I've come off of the hydrocodone, the rest of my body is dealing with getting its regularity back in shape, if you know what I mean. So what I had hoped was going to be a high-powered presentation today is really kind of be more like a sharing with you all something that's important with me and hoping that you might find it meaningful. And if I can stay awake, we'll get through a good discussion. All my life in various religious systems that I've been involved in, I've always been drawn to the expression of mysticism. In theological language, mysticism is an unmediated experience of the holy, not just unmediated by priests or ministers or imams or rabbis, but unmediated by theological systems or indeed even by words. In 1984, while a priest in the Episcopal Church, I helped to found the Order of Julian of Norwich, a monastic order for monks and nuns devoted to Julian of Norwich, England, a 14th century English mystic. She wrote about Christian mysticism about the same time that the Sephardic Jews in Spain were beginning to explore the mystical expression of Judaism. I was an associate of that order for many years. Now, I realize, however, that while I have some life and teaching background in the mystical experience, the Jewish experience of it is still fairly new to me. So I really do invite you, Rabbi, to listen carefully and jump in with caveats or corrections wherever you feel it might be needed. I will admit that some of what I'm going to cover in the development of the presentation is going to be quite generalized in order to get to the main point without going through several hours of background, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions that might come up with. And then finally, I also want to ask that we all take care to keep in mind in the foreground of our minds the suffering that is going on, even as we're talking, within the borders of Israel and Gaza, and pray that God may grant peace. So with that having said, and then finally, I hope there's going to be, we'll get some group participation in this. So I'm counting on folks to have some things to say. Rabbi, we can go ahead and get ready to cue up the clip. In 1956, a key event in the life of American Jews took place, the release of the movie The Ten Commandments. Director Cecil B. DeMille and his cadre of screenwriters took upon themselves the staggering task of presenting in video format the drama of the Exodus. We take our title, Letters of Flame, from the way they decided to portray the actual giving of the Ten Commandments. Let's watch this scene as if you've never seen it before, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
From the burning bush, O Lord, you charged me to bring the people to this holy mountain, to behold your glory and receive your law. What have I left undone?
Anything that is thy neighbor.
Written with the finger of God.
Go, get thee down, for thy people have corrupted themselves.
Okay, we can cut there, I think.
So do you want
Okay,
this
cut
lined up?
there, and let's go. I'll try and see some people here. Okay, so that's my favorite scene in the whole movie, and aside from the fact that that number one, Moses is able to pick up those two stone tablets that must have weighed tremendous amount each, one in each hand, and the fact that that it appears that God has given him the Ten Commandments according to the Christian interpretation of the order of the commandments. Aside from that, what stood out for you as you watched and listened? Anybody have a comment?
Yeah, I one thing that interested me in that was that the research that they actually used the ancient Hebrew lettering instead of the one that most of us are familiar with. It would have been much easier for them to use the more familiar Hebrew alphabet that we know today instead of the more ancient one.
That's actually a good point, and probably not something that that DeMille intended to do, but he actually further accomplished what I'm suggesting was a good accomplishment by giving us the commandments in something that even those who could read Hebrew would not be able to read. So let's hold on to that thought. That's a good point. Anybody else?
Well, I think the column of fire, when you compare the Christian roots in the Shavuot, the Holy Spirit appears to those Jesus followers as if tongues of flame, and so the Holy One is clearly bright.
Okay. It's an image that works across different faith systems.
There's something that struck me is when he says finger of God. I always think the tradition usually tells us that it's al pi Adonai biyad Moshe, from the mouth of God to the hand of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's normally how we consider it being inscribed.
But of course, DeMille is he's got the problems of somebody creating a motion picture, and so he needs to give us a physical representation somehow. And the moving finger of God probably did that better for him than the mouth. But they would both fall in the same category of what I'm about to get at. When you looked at this clip, what did you see or not see that struck you? Because what I'm going to suggest is that DeMille and his cadre of screenwriters, while probably motivated just by trying to get something dramatic on film without going overboard in terms of Torah study, did something brilliant that they didn't intend to do.
Well, this is Richard. I don't know if you're going for this. How you doing, first of all?
Hey.
I don't know if you're going for this, but the notion of in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the voice of God was heard by all the Israelites at the same time at the giving of the law. And here, of course, it's a mixed message. I'm not sure if this is where you're going, but this was obviously heard only by Moses there. The other thing I'd say, by the way, that was phenomenal was he took these stones off the wall, and they had to have been scorching hot, but he seems to have had hands of steel. It's another metaphor, I guess.
Well, God's arm is not shortened and can do whatever he wants. So he made it hot enough to engrave the letters and then cool off instantly, I guess. The thing that really stands out for me is how visual that that presentation was. I know that we also have this sonorous voice of God proclaiming, and Rabbi, there's your by the mouth of God, this sonorous voice of God proclaiming the words of the commandment as the fiery finger of God smashes it into the rock. What stands out for me is even though we hear this voice, it's not important in a didactic sort of way. We're not listening with bated breath to the words of what is it that God is saying. The voice comes across in the same way as the tower of flame and the wildly swinging arm of flame and hitting the rock. It's all a very, very physical experience. And so what DeMille did here, I'm sure entirely unintentionally, is that he was saying to us, the experience of the majesty of God is the important thing of what's going on. And that Moses does not leave the mountain thoroughly trained and indoctrinated and learned in all the details of the Torah, but just gobsmacked, knocked sideways by his experience of the power of God. And that has a lot to do with mystical approach to interpreting Torah, which we'll get at in a minute. So one comes away from the scene not well educated in the meaning and issues of the text of the Ten Commandments, because we almost don't even remember the words. We remember the sound of the voice, and we remember the flame. But we come away with an awe-filled experience of the majesty of God. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about that?
Yeah, well, one thing that I never noticed before, I've probably seen the movie, I haven't seen it in a long time, but the movement of Moses, I was just drawn to how he was moving in closer and then backing away and then getting even further away across like a crevice and then back in again close and moving away. And it was like, I want to be in the presence of the holy. No way I want to be in the presence of the holy. I want to be in the presence of the holy. And so even Moses, I mean, and I have no idea if that's what he was trying to, what DeMille was trying to do, but I got this sense of Moses just being, not knowing how to deal with this, but being drawn and repelled at the same time.
Yeah, and Jews have prayed that way ever since, haven't we? At least the Orthodox among us. We do it in shorthand now, Jim. Instead of stepping forward and stepping backwards, we just stay in one place and rock. But that's kind of left over from that. There's was it Rudolf Otto in the idea of the holy wrote about the concept of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery of God that is at the same time terrifying and fascinating. And this is what Moses is experiencing there on the mountain. And that is a very mystical sort of way of having an experience of God. It's not didactic. It's not learning things. It's not being educated in how should we then live, but it is having this incredible firsthand experience of the majesty of God. So let's go from there to slide 1, Rabbi, and ask the question, what sort of Jew are you? And I'm going to move this up so I can see it a little bit better here. It struck me as, now we need to back, yeah, okay. It struck me that when we ask what sort of Jew are you, today we think of, well, does that mean Orthodox or Reform or conservative or any of the other newer expressions? But there have been lots of different kinds of Jews in the history of Judaism. And we might say starting with what could be called Rabbinic Judaism or Halakhic Judaism, based on the event of Sinai and the text of the Torah and the Talmud and the Midrashes. Maybe what you might call today kind of standard Judaism. But to the one side and the other of that, down through the ages, there have been two other very significant expressions of Judaism. One being Jewish philosophy, which is based mainly on Aristotelian and Islamic philosophy, and the other is Jewish mysticism. All of those developments took place, very loosely, very, 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 very loosely, from the post-Talmudic period up through the 14th, 15th, 16th century. Most of it took place in Southern Europe. Most of it took place in Spain. Most of it took place among Sephardic Jews, because at the time, those of us who have a Northern European heritage need to remember that at the time, what was becoming Ashkenazic Judaism was made up of a bunch of serfs working out in the field and not very educated. And all the highly educated Jews were Sephardic, because they were products of the Islamic Empire, which at the time had most of the learning in the world. So on the one hand, we have Jewish philosophy, in which probably the key voice in that is somebody whose name you'll recognize, Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, working on how we can have a knowledge of God from the rationalist standpoint of secular philosophy. And indeed, Maimonides' famous treatise, A Guide for the Perplexed, was actually a guide for people who were schooled in Aristotelian philosophy and yet were Jewish, and they were perplexed about how they could do both things, be an Aristotelian philosopher and a Sinai Jew at the same time. A lot of people think Maimonides did not do a great job with that guide, because all of his in this particular work, all of his allegiance really was with the philosopher. And so it developed among Jewish philosophy a concept of God in which God is absolutely transcendent, not personal at all, has no body parts or passions, and indeed has no need for people or for people to carry out and obey commandments, because if any of that were true, that would mean that God could change from time to time, which would mean that there was less than total unity in God. And so Maimonides did a great job of bringing Jewish theology into the existing world of the philosophers, but was not terribly edifying maybe to your run-of-the-mill Jewry. And so what began to appear, not in southern Spain, but in northern Spain, in Castile and across the Pyrenees in the Provence area of France, was an idea of how to abstract the idea of God along with modern philosophy, and yet retain somehow the personality of the God of Sinai. And this is where several versions of Jewish mysticism were born. And now I'm going to skip over 3 semesters of lecture about how all that took place, just to say that in the year 1300, in Provence, a book appeared by the name of Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Shining, or the Book of Radiance. And the Zohar is a fascinating book. First of all, let me say that from its appearance around 1300 until the appearance of the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, it was one of the major works of Jewish theology in Europe, and for a long time among many people was considered to be on a par canonically with the Talmud and the Midrashim. It's written as a commentary on the Torah, but it is written in the format of fantastical fairy tales. And the entire book is all metaphor and imagery. So it makes it very difficult for a person who is not studying it to even see what's going on. but therein lies the story of why we can look at the Ten Commandments in some different ways. Comment or question before I go on? Okay, so we've got what we kind of consider to be maybe ordinary Judaism, which is kind of like what most of us experience most of the time. On the other hand, we have Jewish philosophy, which is trying to bring Judaism into the, at that time, modern philosophical world. And then at the other side, we have Jewish mysticism, which was a reaction against the philosophers, saying, no, God is an experienceable thing, just not like somebody who sounds like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. God's more mysterious than that. But the whole point of the mystical movement in Judaism was to say, how can we understand God in a way that we can have a direct experience of God in God's self, even though we're kind of side with the philosophers in that there's nothing in our meager language that we can come up with that can actually describe it. But whereas the philosophers were willing to leave it there and say, well, we just can't even talk about it, the mystics wanted to say, it's not describable, but it's experienceable. And so that left the Jewish mystics with the challenge of trying to write about something that couldn't be written about so that other people could experience it. And with that, Rabbi, we're going to go to the second slide. But before I talk about it, I want to share with you something called the parable of the wheat. And this is from the Zohar. There was a man who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those who lived in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city, and they offered him good bread. The man asked, "What's it made of?" And they answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. He tasted them and asked, "What are these made of?" And they answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. He asked, "And what are these made of?" And again they answered, "Wheat." He said, "Surely I'm the master of all of these, since I eat the essence of all of these, wheat." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost on him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights deriving and diverging from that principle. And the writer went on to suggest that wheat and its products, the kernels, the bread, the cake, and the pastry, symbolize 4 levels of meaning in the Torah: simple, homiletical, allegorical, and mystical. And I don't know about you, Rabbi, but this just flies in the face of everything I was ever taught in seminary about how to do exegesis and how to write a sermon. But the idea is there are 3 levels of meaning in every Torah portion. One is the simple meaning or the literal text. Oftentimes, if we get a group of people together in a Torah study, we will spend most of our time working at that level. And that's a fine level, but the mystics said, but there's more to come. There's not just kernels of wheat, there's also bread and cake and fine pastry. So the next level of understanding is homiletical or midrash, which you were doing some of in the last session, where you took a story from the book of Esther and then experienced a midrash of sorts on it, in which things were added in order to come to a new understanding of what the whole passage had to say to us. And most preachers, most rabbis, most Christian clergy who are doing sermons will operate at this level of saying not only what does the text say, but what are the things I can learn from it? What are images I can bring from here and there to mix with it, and so I can expand my experience of that Torah portion. But then it goes on beyond that, because the philosophers said, well, there's an allegorical level. And that is that forget about what the literal story says. Everything in the story, everything in the text of Torah is about God. So therefore, if it doesn't look like it's about God, it must mean because there's some kind of allegory going on that will tell us something about God. And so we need to study it from that standpoint of let's explore what the literal text might be saying allegorically about the nature of God. And then of course the mystics said, now you're getting into our ballpark, because beyond the allegorical is the mystical. And basically the mystical approach to Torah interpretation is, after you've talked about the simple meaning and the midrashic meaning, then you ask the question, but what does this teach us about God? And if it leads me to think about something that's not even in the literal text, I can do that, because my goal is not to learn about the text. My goal is to learn about God. And so with the mystical interpretation, the sky is the limit. And of course, what makes it difficult for folks who are not used to reading at that level when they pick up a copy of the Zohar is what they seem to be reading is unintelligible. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of Zohar teachers around these days to help us with that. But fortunately, we do have a lot, because the Zohar is coming back into vogue, and we now have some pretty good academic writings about that. Any questions about the different levels of Torah interpretation? Simple meaning, homiletical, allegorical, and mystical.
Is there like for those of us, well, for me, who is a beginner in understanding this, is there a book you might recommend that I could start with?
Yeah, there is, and you have to be really careful if you just do a search on Amazon, because another term, a popular term for Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah. And the whole entire world has taken over a fascination with Kabbalah. And there's a tremendous amount of Christian Kabbalah and New Age Kabbalah. So you have to be careful just searching on your own. The best book that I have found so far, the two best books, one is not in print but is still completely available, is Gershom Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, and it can be found very cheaply in used copies, either on Amazon or A-Libris, for instance. And then the person who wrote the introduction to Daniel Matt's volume of the Zohar has also an individual book that is an expansion of his introduction called Understanding the Zohar. And his name is Arthur Green. And it's published by Stanford University Press. You can get it on Amazon, and it's inexpensive. It's a good way to break into it. Any other questions or comments? So we're going to get ready now to step from the simple meaning of the text and skip over the homiletical and the allegorical and see if we can zip right into a mystical approach to the Ten Commandments. And so my next question is, let me get some of my notes in order here. Let's look at the Ten Commandments. And for a gold star and a front row seat at Shabbat Torah study, Who can tell me where in Torah we find the 10 Commandments?
Exodus, Deuteronomy.
Is that Richard?
Yes, doctor.
Yeah. Okay. In 2 places in Exodus and 1 place in
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. Let's go ahead and put that slide back up now, Rabbi. Because unfortunately, the answer to that question is nowhere. Nowhere in the Torah are the 10 Commandments mentioned by name.
Mentioned by name.
In Exodus 20, verses 1 through 4, we have the passage that we most think about, and we'll read it in just a minute. God spoke these words, Devarim, saying, and then in Deuteronomy 5 through 18 is when Moses recounts that same experience. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you. And then in Exodus 34, 10 to 28 is kind of the second set of 10 Commandments in which God replaces the ones that Moses broke. He wrote down on the tablets the terms of the covenant, the 10 Commandments, Aseret HaDevarim, and then a somewhat different kind of listing of the commandments is listed there. But what intrigued me was everybody knows these are the 10 Commandments, and everybody knows that the word commandment in Hebrew is what? Anybody?
Mitzvah.
Mitzvah.
Mitzvah, and plural mitzvot. And if you open up your Bible, depending on the English translation you have, you may actually even have a place where it refers to, in your English translation, as the 10 Commandments. But if you look in the Hebrew text, nowhere will you see the phrase 10 Commandments, but Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words or the 10 utterances. So this leads Torah scholars to have something of a debate about these 10 Commandments. Are they part of the 613? Well, they're not called commandments in the text. What is it about them that makes them stand out and separate out from the 613? Remembering what we just read in the parable of the wheat, the farmer had the essence of the idea of wheat, the kernel, if you will, but he was missing out on all the higher uses to which wheat could be put. The Zohar challenges us to look at this 10 utterances passage, not for its plain meaning, or even for its instructional homiletical meaning, but for its mystical meaning, remembering the Zohar position that every word of Scripture is about God, not about you or about me or how to live a godly life, but about the person and nature of God. So let's take a moment and just read the standard translation from Exodus of the 10 Commandments. Would somebody like to read that slide?
All right.
Okay. Who is that?
Me, Carol?
Yeah, okay, go ahead and read.
I am the Lord your, and God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Okay, so what strikes you about the Ten Commandments, about their purpose, about what they're telling us? What have the Ten Commandments always been to you? Anybody have any thoughts or comments?
A guide
Okay.
for the way I live.
One of the classic responses to that question, Will, is the first half, the first five are how our relationship builds and evolves with God, and the other is how our relationship builds and evolves with our fellow human beings.
Mm-hmm. In fact, you could take those two halves and set them side by side and see a parallel between each one about our responsibility to God and our responsibility to others. If you juggle it around a little bit. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to go from teaching to meddling now, and somewhat tongue in cheek. So please don't anybody actually respond to me on this. But we could start out by saying, okay, everybody who has never broken any one of these 10 commandments, raise your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we could say, well, okay, how about everybody who's only broken one? Or how about everybody who's only broken two? One of the things that strikes me about these commandments is that in many ways they are almost unkeepable.
Good point.
That's not to say there's anything wrong with them, anything bad with them, but they are so perfect. They are so marvelously expressive of the perfection that supposedly God demands that they're just not doable. So much so that it's led some commentators to say, well, God knew that to begin with. And this was a setup. And the point was to let you know how impossible it is to be like God. And then some other things come along that are kind of enabling commandments. And some other things come along that are provisions for forgiveness. But that these 10 are the 10 that are the perfection that we should strive for. That's actually very close to the mystical interpretation, which would say that these 10 commandments are not about you and me at all. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal is not about how you should go out and live your life this afternoon. But it's more about what the nature of God is. So a mystical approach to these 10 commandments would be, first of all, to drop the English word commandment. I asked Rabbi about this. I said, well, okay, we understood what it said in Hebrew. And I asked, well, when do we start calling it commandments? Rabbi, do you remember what you said to that?
I don't remember if I had a chronological answer. I don't recall one.
Well, we were fishing around for it, and I said, well, it sounds to me like maybe that was something that the Christian theologians, the Christian translators came up with, and since they had the majority of commentators and scholars and people in the pews, that it just became the coin of the realm. It became what you called those things. And gradually, we Jews just started calling them the 10 Commandments too, even though in our language, the word is not there.
Did it start with Greek interpretation?
Well, I guess it might have, and I have not looked at the Greek to see.
Just keeping track of the time a little bit. We will probably 10 minutes at the most right now left.
Right. Okay. So anyway, we see that if we just take the 10 Commandments literally, there really are some textual questions about how do we do this, because they're not like the other 613, and they don't even call themselves commandments. So let's go to the next slide for about a half a minute. If any of you have ever heard of the word Kabbalah before or seen anything written about Kabbalah, you may have seen this diagram. Raise your hand if you and wave if you've seen this diagram before. And all these little circles are called Sephirot, which originally meant numbers or even circles. And they are a way that came out of the Jewish philosophers into the realm of the mystics to try to explain the nature of God. And the problem that Jews were dealing with was that they were committed, as we still are, to the absolute unity of the Godhead. The problem is, once you've said God is one, you've exhausted everything you can say. And so they were trying to say, well, yes, but what is God really like? And so these circles show how the available experience of God begins with the totally unknowable, totally transcendent God that nobody can talk about, to the first emergence of God's idea that he was going to create something, to the creation of wisdom and understanding, and so on and so forth, down through the Sephirot, to come out to the one at the bottom, which is usually considered to represent the Shekinah, or the presence of God. This is all a picture of what we mean is going on in the personhood of God, the one God. Mystics got into a lot of trouble with this, as you can guess, because some people thought they had become polytheists, and other people thought that they had become pantheists, in that God, the one God, is present in everywhere in creation. But it was a way of trying to explain the unexplainable. The Christians have the same thing, and they call it the Trinity. And to be totally and absolutely fair to the Christians, they don't mean that literally. They mean it in an allegorical, mystical sort of way. And to be totally fair to the Kabbalists in mystical Judaism, they don't mean the 10 literally. They mean it in a mystical sort of way of explaining the unexplainable. Now, we don't have time to go through all of this, but I throw this picture up here as a way to jump into the last slide. Because there are 10 Sephirot, 10 different aspects of the one God, and lo and behold, there are 10 utterances. And utterances are the way, as the rabbi pointed out at the very beginning of this discussion, that God brought the world into existence and gave Moses the law, the 10 utterances. So what I did was I took the 10 utterances and I laid them out on the format of the Kabbalah's Sephirot, or different aspects of God. And so if just briefly looking at it, the first 3 commandments, Aleph, Bet, and Gimel, are on the part of this diagram of God that is essentially the unknown transcendent Godhead in God's self that you and I never have any contact with. And they are, lo and behold, very much about the essential nature of God. I am, and I am one, and I am the only one. And then the next 5 are comments on the nature of God that, given the idea of God's transcendent majesty and holiness and rule over creation, in the existence of such a God, there would not be people dishonoring fathers and mothers. There would not be people stealing things. There would not be people committing murder. And so rather than these being commandments of what you should or should not do, they are descriptions of the consequences of the basic nature of the God who comes out of unknowable infinity to create the universe. And so we're at like, this is like the first hour introduction to a semester course in a mystical way of looking at the Ten Commandments. But what I want to do is finish up here with the idea that it turns out that Cecil B. DeMille had the right idea after all, that these commandments are not about you and about me. In fact, they're not commandments, they're utterances of God about who and what God is. And as with the film, The Ten Commandments, we come away not better versed in the details of commands that we must obey, but overwhelmed with awe before the holy God with whom we are called into relationship. A much more profound way of looking at the 10 utterances that are not just obeying unobeyable rules. And so that's kind of an introduction to a different way of looking at the 10 Commandments. We got a couple of minutes. Anybody have any comments or questions? Rabbi, corrections?
No, you did a great job. I
Will,
learned
Will, are you gonna do a 10-part, you're gonna do a 10-part series at Misfit, part of adult education? Is that what I heard?
Not up to me.
Oh.
You're always welcome. You know that, Will. It means less work for me. People ask about Kabbalah all the time, and I think, it's not my favorite topic, but people are interested.
Well, it would be fun to do something like that. And it would not be done from an academic standpoint. It would be done from a standpoint of an adventure in spirituality.
Well, yeah, and I've used the Daniel Matt has an annotated Zohar, which is actually fairly thin volume, where he takes excerpts from the Zohar and basically annotates, footnotes it all the way through, so that you can at least catch the references, and he gives background. So that's always a good teaching tool.
Yeah, this publication is that with a full commentary added. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you, Will,
Thank
and
you.
thank you for soldiering through your pain and for doing this. And we really appreciate you, and you're bringing your scholarship and your family now along with you today. And it's always good to be able to think about different ways of understanding the text, because right at that plain meaning, sometimes it gets boring. But people want to feel and experience tradition and religion, and see symbolism and things, and to know that we have not an absolute, but at least the Zohar and the Kabbalah as guideposts and starting points to say we don't have to reinvent this mystical wheel. It's a good introduction. So thank you, Will, and thank you everybody for being here. We're going to have a short break, and we have next up will be Lily Dropkin talking about the biblical Lilith. So probably we'll see some overlap between the two topics in some way when we start talking about Lilith and where we see and understand her from the biblical perspective. So I encourage everybody to keep sticking around.
Thank you.
And if you need a drink or food or the sherutim, as we say in Hebrew, do that now.
We have you 7 more hours, so take your breaks where you can.
I will be in this chair for all of them.
I will as well. I think there's going to be a permanent imprint in this hotel chair. I see 5 of you ditching me. I saw it. I'm so offended.
You'll see me till it's all over. So
Yeah. Oh, it's fine. I've actually, some people might have heard this before. I will admit I've taught it before.
We're
both
looking
the
forward to it.
both the rabbi and I sort of talked about it. We were like, oh, we'll just do like best ofs for he and I, where we're sort of filling in some of the gaps.
not gonna lie, this is the one I'm like most excited about.
Oh God, no pressure.
Same.
Beckett, you've heard me pontificate about this a lot. It's the same thing I pontificate every time that you get me started on it.
But still, it's nice. I still find it interesting.
Fair. Okay.
I'm just really interested in this. Like, I even named my bicycle Lilith. So like,
Nice.
so
No, I like
I'm
it.
into this topic. I've read a lot about it.
No,
I
it's
just like
great.
that you followed the word Lilith with fair. That made me laugh a little bit.
Did you,
We have a Lilith in the congregation.
Wow.
Who's that?
Rosemary.
Wasn't there,
Rosemary's
remember
middle
being
name
a-
is Lilith, and that's what Sean calls her.
I did
wasn't
not
like-
know.
oh,
Interesting.
wasn't that Cheers? There was a woman that Lilith.
Maybe. I
Yeah.
think that's a little before my time.
Yes, see, that was
Fraser's
Fraser's
wife.
wife was Lilith.